Let's see, get it together.
We're officially started.
Were you invoking something for the AG? All right, so I guess. Okay, great. So I will kick off the opening of today's work session training and turn it over immediately to somebody else.
To Katie. Okay. To Katie and Laurel.
Great. So Chair Allen and Director Sumption and members of the commission. Today, what we're going to do a work session on ocean shore vehicle access rules. The purpose is really to provide a framework for the discussion on ocean shore vehicle access. The process that we use for consideration of changes to vehicle access zones. It's slightly different than our regular rulemaking because we have statutes that require a process that we go through for considering changes to vehicle access zones. So today I'm sitting here, but online, Laurel Hillman is our ocean shores policy expert, technical expert. And then in the room behind me, J.R. Collier and Dennis Comfort are our technical on the ground experts. So they will be able to answer questions and chime in throughout the presentation, and then Chris Havel can provide some of the background and historical context. So it's a collaborative presentation from all of them. I am not the technical expert on all of this. And we really want to have a discussion with all of you. We're going to go through, I'm going to give you the statutes and the rules around beach driving, ocean shore vehicle access. I often go into beach driving. And we'll talk through the statutes and the policy and some of the trends that are happening now. But feel free to ask questions, raise some of your thoughts. We want to talk about what the policy is, what the framework is, and then if there are resources, we understand that right now we have a rule that's open, but we will also likely be getting more of these requests in the future. So we want to talk through what the process is, where we may need additional resources and research. And then we also have Steve Shipsey here from a legal perspective as there are legal questions. So with that, this is guided by a statute. ORS 390-678 establishes that the department has the ability to establish zones for motor vehicle and aircraft use. When we establish a zone, we need to we can do restrictions or prohibitions, and we have to post signs.
Okay, stop.
Okay.
So this says without a zone, anything happens, and with a zone, something happens, or is it the opposite? Most Oregonians think I can drive on any beach. And so what does it really say? That we do zones, and other than that, it's whatever traditionally has happened?
It says we can establish zones where travel by motor vehicles shall be restricted or prohibited.
In other words, so it's the zones have restrictions, everything else does not. I'm looking at our lawyer and he's nodding.
Yeah,
That's a clear distinction.
I think
and
that's
an
correct.
important distinction.
And you have established the zones, and it's more that unless stated as open, it's prohibited. So,
So say that one again. I thought we were at a point where it had to have a zone to be restricted.
and that's right. And then so the way they did that was they said in these zones it's allowed.
So everything's restricted.
Oh,
So it's restricted.
So it-
permits.
So we took that
So it's the
state
opposite.
ORS and reversed it.
In rule.
Yeah. Okay.
And as soon as my computer starts chirping, I'll confirm that.
Within the rules, we have everything mapped out. So we have open zones, we have restricted zones, we have prohibited zones. So everything has been mapped and zoned since 1970.
1970?
It looks like, yeah, 1972, some of them. We have some,
And that was under OPRD?
Would have been ODOT.
It would have been
ODOT,
ODOT.
under ODOT.
Yeah,
Oh, we inherited that from ODOT.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
So we do have to post signs, and once we've established a zone, individuals have to conform to our uses.
And the zones are established in rural.
Correct. The thing that is unique about this statute is the way that a zone can be initiated. It can be initiated one of three ways. It can be the department initiating a zone, 20 or more landowners or residents, and it does not specify how that happens, or at the request of a governing body or the county or city contiguous to the proposed zone. So you may remember 2 years ago when Tillamook County requested the change at Cape Condo, we did it at the request of the county. The current proposed rules we have are from the city of Lincoln City, so it's a request from the city. So it can be a county or a city, but it has to be contiguous to the zone. The 20 or more landowners or residents, it says that one is a little more vague, so that there's some room for interpretation about what that means.
So does it say anything about where those 20 landowners are?
The Seaboard area.
I mean, does Burns work?
It says, in the air, it just says it initiated 20 or more landowners or residents. So we are assuming that in the area, but it doesn't say within the county or,
Contiguous or.
yeah, that's,
From Hardy County.
So that, I mean,
They care about
facetious,
nature.
that's exactly the question.
so, yeah, that one's kind of a question from what I understand. Do you want the statute? Would that be helpful?
Until it crashes. Yeah, I got it.
Because I have a couple copies. Because it's hard. So there's that one. And then it moves on to the process. We have to hold a public hearing in the vicinity, post it in the newspaper. And then we need to seek the approval of a local government adjacent or contiguous. So with Tillamook County, they asked us, so they approved because they had asked us. With Lincoln County or Lincoln City, we will need to go back to them, and because the way they worded their resolution, we studied it, so we will go back to them and ask for their approval of the final proposal.
So the words on the screen there is seek the approval. Does that mean the approval has to be obtained?
Sounds like that's what they're interpreting.
Seek.
It's a good
The
question.
statute says seek the approval.
What does that mean legally? Gypsy?
Go ahead.
Sorry, Katie.
Yeah, the statute very much says seek the approval.
Yeah.
What did they say? more?
So I think that would be an interesting question, like, say we were to seek the approval of a certain area for a master plan and they didn't approve it, what would we be able to do?
So, yeah, we could legally take it on.
I would say that that's a coordination requirement and that there's case law on what coordination means. And you would have to seek the approval. If they made objection, you'd have to consider that. If you didn't agree with the objection, you would have to make findings as to why that, that the comment you received back, you accommodated to the greatest extent practicable, and then yet still proceeded in a different way to achieve your regulatory jurisdictional goals.
I have a question. The term newspaper
Right.
There's actually,
seems rather dated.
there's in public records, there's new statutes that are being created this session, so that allows for digital subscriptions to be included, so I think that will work.
So newspaper the meaning of it will be expanded to include how people actually find out about them.
I mean, and we do other things to let people know, but
Katie, does the statute also, it says or landing of any aircraft. So does that apply to drones too? Is the statute also intended for that? Sorry.
Yeah.
Not to open a can of worms, but I'm sure we're-
It's a good question. Hadn't really. We,
Your favorite subject.
yeah,
Katie.
no, that's,
Sorry.
we prohibit aircraft on, except for emergency, but we have allowed drones, so we haven't considered them the same.
An emergency landing of a drone.
Yeah, I would think that any definition we had associated with these rules or the statute would predate drones, so we would have to look how aircraft was defined. But it wouldn't expressly say drone. It would have to say, you'd be looking at it to see if it fell within the kind of the language that we have.
But I think it's something we should look at as
Yeah,
we write our drone rules, and I think that drone statutes wouldn't allow us to preempt. Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry. Yeah.
He's asking, good luck with that.
So we're gonna move on. So now if we move on to the administrative rules. So in administrative rule, we do have a policy that is intended to help guide how we determine what zones to restrict or prohibit. And it's looking at the safe public use, protecting scenic recreation values, and considering ocean resources. So the intent was to really define that, and there are specific criteria within the policy for establishing zones. So they look at safety. There's specific safety criteria. It's beach use, and it's defined beach space, hazardous condition, and onshore residence. And then under access, it's looking at need, wood gathering, and people with disabilities. So the impact on those activities. And then recreation and scenic values, it's scenic considerations. So saying that we wouldn't have driving on the beach by a scenic viewpoint. And then recreational impacts. So looking at what the recreational uses are at a specific area. Under natural resources, they're considering, the rules say considering intertidal marine life, clam beds, wildlife habitat, coastal vegetation. So you're using these as criteria for evaluating zones. And then beach management is looking at the public services that are involved. So that's management access. So things like law enforcement, search and rescue, fire rescue, litter, the availability of patrols, enforcement, if the costs for enforcement are too high. It specifically says if costs of enforcement are too high, areas could be closed. And then just general public costs for an area. So those are some of the considerations that are put into rule.
When was this rule promulgated? Do you remember?
It was last done in 1992. It was first done in 1979, and then it was last updated in 1992.
So with wood gathering, I mean, is it something that
In the past, we would do permits for people to gather driftwood for firewood. Yeah, firewood. And then the next rule that we wanted to cover is the specific county by county restrictions. So we have a rule with each county, and we start from the north to the south, and it specifically looks at what areas are open, restricted, or closed. And then we do specifically have 2 counties that have a speed limit added. So in Clatsop and Tillamook, there's a speed limit of 15 miles per hour. In a different rule, we have a speed limit of 25 miles per hour on all open areas to driving and 10 miles on any area that's closed.
But it's closed.
If it's closed, we have a permit, and we'll go over the
Okay,
permit
okay.
later on. So that's why in Division 21, we have a speed limit. That's general speed limit, but for Tillamook and Clatsop County, there's a reduced speed limit.
And Tillamook County is what?
15.
15.
Have you seen him do 15?
Oh. Then walking
that be
by
nice?
and they go whoosh.
And aircraft are specifically prohibited in each county, except for emergency landing.
So in other words, every county says no aircraft,
Yes,
so it's kind of a non-issue.
but the drone issue, I think we will want to look at that and
Yeah.
the definitions of drones as aircraft and.
How much?
And
Is
that's
an
the
airplane-
state, is that a state regulation?
That's a
federal. Federal.
So does that make them qualify then as aircraft instead of drones?
Yeah. If it's
So-
under half pound. Maybe it's not their problem. Minus the doing it.
Minus the enforcement.
So, and we will show you a copy of some of the maps that are included in the rule currently. But it has a point by point, you can drive here to here. Some of them are seasonal closures. Sometimes they're closures on the weekends or different times. Some of them are permanent closures. It really varies widely. And then Laurel's going to share about snowy plover closures.
Oh,
Aren't they cute?
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
we can.
Okay, Chair Allen, Director Assumption, members of the commission. My name is Laurel Hillman. I'm the Ocean Shore Resource Coordinator for OPRD, and one of my duties is management of the Habitat Conservation Plan for the Western Snowy Plover. So on this slide, you'll see some pictures of cute baby plovers. A second picture, I don't know which direction to point you to because I'm not sure what it looks like in the room, but you should see some cute plover chicks along with a parent sitting on a nest, just to demonstrate why we have those seasonal restrictions in plover designated protected wildlife areas. Those are the sites identified in our Western Snowy Plover Habitat Conservation Plan, because plovers are especially sensitive during the breeding season as they nest and raise their tiny chicks. You can sort of see potentially one of the chicks next to a shell for scale. I also like to refer to them as cotton balls on toothpicks. So that's why it's important that they nest and raise their chicks on open, dry sand beach areas. Adults and chicks will also shelter in tire tracks, as shown in one of the photos on the bottom of the slide. So OPRD and partners identify these sites with signage, and our beach rangers patrol the areas to provide outreach and obtain compliance as necessary. Next slide, please. Do I have control? I don't think I have it. Okay.
I don't know why I can't.
So this map on the left just sort of demonstrates the variety of our plover designated management areas up and down the coast, all the way from Clatsop Spit down to the south coast, although those sites on the south coast aren't currently being managed for occupancy. But mostly I just wanted to show that the majority of, even though there's a bunch of sites all up and down the coast, most of those sites are closed already year-round to motor vehicles. For example, Nehalem State Park and Sitka Sedge State Natural Area, but a few are open seasonally, such as Coos Bay, North Spit, and the North Quad Jetty area, other than during the snowy plover nesting season. Both of those sites are primarily managed by our federal land management partners, while OPRD manages the wet sand areas. And so these are some examples of the maps that Katie talked about that are in our beach rule enforcement booklet that all the beach rangers and coastal park staff have access to. So the one for Coos County helps demonstrate sites that might be allowed except during plover season, like the Coos Bay North Spit, which is on the middle of that map, whereas the Lane County map on my right, I'm not sure what it is in the room, sorry, but the map that's labeled Lane County will show designated plover area, but that section of beach south of Faceta Head is closed year round already for other reasons. So that's what I've got. If you have any questions, feel free.
Are there other besides snowy plover? That we restrict other animals, just that bird?
There might be other areas that have been closed over the years due to other natural resource or other resource concerns, but these are the only seasonal restrictions that I know of that we actively sign and manage because of the habitat conservation plan that we developed over a number of years. So I would have to dig into more of the reason behind all the other previous closures or restrictions, but there are other sensitive wildlife, seabirds, marine mammals along the coast that could have, we don't have open driving areas in hardly any, if at all, rocking or tidal areas that would be near seabird nesting areas, for example. So that's another sensitive species that, or habitat that would potentially have been the reason for why some of those areas are closed year round.
This may be a tough question to answer, but what do we have significant, what's the situation in terms of people adhering to the restrictions and not encroaching on these areas? Is it something takes a lot of time and effort to ensure that that's not happening? Or, I mean, I know it's a hard question to answer in a general way, but.
In a general way, it has improved. Some of the areas on the North Coast that haven't been, they were historically plover nesting areas, but in recent history, plovers hadn't nested there. It was somewhat difficult to obtain compliance, but through repeated years of a lot of concerted effort of our dedicated coastal park and beach rangers, compliance has increased at those sites. We do occasionally get folks driving in there and requires beach ranger compliance contacts at those sites. And I do have some of those numbers from our annual compliance report, so I could get those to you at a future meeting if that was of interest.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's helpful what you said. Thanks.
Much better than early years.
Steven?
So. So something on the next screen piqued my interest when it said e-bike. Where's mountain bike and e-bikes fit into these rules?
So we will talk about trends, but because we didn't change the e-bike rules, we've allowed e-bikes in areas where motorized vehicles are allowed. And then we didn't make any changes, so they're not allowed in the closed sections except for that. So I did move to the next screen. We do issue vehicle permits for people with disabilities, and we've issued permits for e-bikes as a accommodation for somebody with a disability.
But you treat them as a motorbike in all other areas, which I think's right.
They're a motor vehicle.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk about it on the next slide, but we want to have that conversation again because we've had complaints on both sides that we have more people using them. We don't have, and I think Dennis can talk more, we don't have the enforcement capacity to enforce no e-bikes. So then we get complaints from people who see an e-bike and then it's not being enforced. And so we need to look at that rule again to see if there's a different option.
Question, going back to the snowy plover. Laurel?
March 15th to September 15th.
Yeah, it's March 15th to September 15th.
Oh, okay, there he's up there.
So it's all during the summer when everybody's there.
And where is it on the spectrum of the endangered species? Like how threatened or endangered? Yeah, is it recovering? Is it getting worse? Where are we at?
Thank you for the question. Yes, they are still listed as threatened. They're not listed, have never been listed as endangered. But in Oregon, we have reached our goal of more than 250 breeding pairs. But the population is a combined population with California and Washington for the purposes of delisting or recovery. So we are still quite a ways from meeting that goal as a population.
Thanks.
Okay. So if we go to permits, we have an administrative rule around vehicle permits. We issue permits for people with disabilities, for permits to drive on the beach in an area that's otherwise closed, for construction, for scientific research, and for other reasons. We have created a new online request form, and they're processed on a case-by-case basis. For people with disabilities, we've started a process where we work through the Coast Region office, and our beach rangers and district managers process those and look at time, place, manner. Sometimes it's a one-time permit, and sometimes it's for a time period, and work with people to come up with a place. We are working more with local governments, and there are more places where people can access the beach without driving. So Lincoln City has Moby mats, and there are a number of places where there are wheelchairs on the beach that may be a better option or a different option than people have had in the past, but there still are permits, and you can use a vehicle, an ATV or an e-bike for some of those permits. But it's an ongoing process to make that system work better. Does.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm appreciating this presentation very much. And for one, just wanted to say hello and that I'm here. But also, I find this part really interesting because we do see on the North Coast frequently vehicles on the beach for a variety of purposes, and I assume they're all going through this process. When I see those vehicles, I don't tend to see permits on dashboards and so forth, but I assume they must have them with them. And I'm wondering a couple of things, just how widely we issue these. If there are serious restrictions, for example, if we have somebody who is trying to access the beach, asserting a certain kind of disability, do we request any sort of verification of that? Do we do anything else? Are there any, is it basically available for the asking? Or is there some kind of verification process associated with it? And I'm also wondering for local governments, for example, because a lot of local governments, especially municipal governments, we see them on the beaches a lot, clearing drainage pipes, removing logs and debris from public access ways and so forth. And I'm wondering in those cases, are they having to request an individual permit every time they have to do that? Or do we create some sort of umbrella agreement with local governments that allow them to have sort of as needed access?
Dennis do the local government. I can tell you about the ADA, but Dennis is gonna do them unless you want to do ADA too.
Good afternoon, Commission. I'm Dennis Comfort, Coastal Region Manager with Oregon State Parks. On the municipality part of driving on the beach, they serve a great purpose, and Cannon Beach is a good example where their city maintenance folks will go down and clean up the beach of all the evening activity, campfires and stuff, and relieve us of having that cleanup duty. And so we'll give them a blanket drive on beach permit for those kinds of things. The fire departments, anybody that needs access. At Seaside, we have lifeguards that drive ATVs down to their lifeguard stations. And so we'll give them an annual permit for those kinds of things. So they have to stick within the restrictions of what it is. They can't just go joyriding, but they don't. And we have good coverage with our park managers and our rangers on the beach to keep an eye on all that kind of stuff. And so every once in a while, maybe something goes sideways, but most of the time it's under good control.
Right.
And for the ADA permits or people with disability permits, it's a self-certification. We don't have the ability to ask people, and we are not certifiers of someone's disability. So they self-certify and they check a box saying that they have a mobility disability that requires it. And so far people are fairly honest, and we do work with them. People don't get to go exactly where they want or for however long they want. We work with them to come up with a place that is safe and a time that's safe and not the most crowded beaches. And so it's an iterative process to make it work for both us and them.
Yeah.
And to eliminate any of the confusion, we have one permit specialist that takes care of all of them. So we don't have different applications of the rule up and down the coast. We have a very similar pragmatic approach to this because there's no easy one answer each time. And so we have to take totality of circumstances. And we, with ADA, for instance, somebody may need access at a location that's not the best for them because of the slope of the beach. And so we're looking at all of those different components. If we get a request in, we'll run it past Helena as well to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure we're not breaking any rules or creating a hardship for somebody. And we're continuing to get better and better at this as we do it. And so one of the main things though is to make sure that we're trying to meet and accommodate that need. And if we can do it in a safe place where they want to, and there's no other things like endangered species issues, then it's on. And if it's not, then we try and find something that's better for the situation.
That's great. I appreciate that very much. Both of those explanations regarding the municipal functions and so on, and those blanket annual permits make a great deal of sense because of the inefficiency of having those city governments contacting us all the time when any little thing comes up, for example. And also the question about verification on disability is actually helpful too. I have occasionally gotten questions as to whether, for example, OPRD cares if somebody is wanting to have beach access for these purposes when they have a temporary condition where they aren't necessarily carrying the usual for example, special parking permit kinds of verification, but maybe they're an elderly person who's had, say, hip surgery and wants to do this and so on. And so those questions come up as to whether we need to meet those thresholds. So it sounds like there's some flexibility in the system, provided that the request is reasonable. And that's very good to know. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. So then just on to our, these are the most recent examples of rulemaking questions. In 2017, there was a request to prohibit vehicles at 34th Street in Lincoln City, and that was not adopted at the time. The comments were in the preponderance of opposition to a closure, and there was a user group that wanted to make changes and improvements at the site. So we determined that we would look at it over time and potentially reconsider it in the future. And that rulemaking is now opened again. So in 2018, we did the electric assisted bicycles and in non-motorized areas. We did not adopt on the ocean shore. We did adopt changes in the park area rules, but not on the ocean shore. In general, the comments were concerned about speed, user conflict, and changing the nature of the ocean shore. So we are looking at tomorrow when we do a rulemaking update. I'll give you an update on some of the rulemaking we're considering. We are going to look at e-bikes and e-mobility devices broadly, and want to look again at, is there, as e-bikes are more ubiquitous across the state, is it an opportunity to reconsider something along something there? And then in 2021, we did make changes at Cape Kiwanda, closing a section near Tierra Del Mar permanently, and then making changes at Cape Kiwanda based on a request from Tillamook County. And currently we have opened for public comment through July 20th, closing 2 sections at Lincoln City, 134th Street permanently, and then 15th Street we would close seasonally from September 30th, from May 1st through September 30th, it would be closed. And that,
On the 35th Court Street that we're talking about closing permanently, that would be a net loss of 150 feet of beach parking. And we were considering moving that 150 feet down to the 15th Street access so there's no net loss of folks' freedoms to do what their granddaddy did. There's a road that goes straight down to the beach that has good parking access, and with the closure through the summertime months when that's the biggest hassle, I think adding that other 150 feet makes some sense, because then there's still some usage for that where people aren't so congested in one area to be able to park on the beach.
This request for rulemaking came from Lincoln County,
Yes.
Lincoln City.
Lincoln City. And this is, the 34th was the same issue that was addressed in 17, and there were no changes.
Right.
Right. Since that time, Lincoln City is now closed the upland access. So somebody cannot get down onto the beach currently at Lincoln City. And at 15th Street, they have seasonally closed it. So it is closed through September 5th. Basically, it's closed for Memorial Day to Labor Day right now.
So we're lining things up on the 17th or back in 2017, when we considered the closure of 35th Court, that because the city owned the upland parking lot and we owned the beach, they weren't at the point where they wanted to close that gate where we could have done the beach side, but this puts us in alignment for closing both accesses.
Where are we in rulemaking? We're open for public comment?
Yeah, the public comments are open. We're getting public comments. We're doing a public hearing in Lincoln City and virtually on July 18th. And then we
I'll be interested in reading the comments.
yeah, we hope to bring it back to you for the September commission meeting. So that is what we have. Is there discussion? Thoughts on resources that you would want, ideas on either additional changes to rule?
For the record, you could drive right there. Just saying, because I walk it and I see e-bikes on it all the time.
Do we know what other states are doing? Have we got any comparison, and is there a reason for us to?
I think we're pretty unique.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we could compare to, nobody else has the whole ocean shore as a state park.
That used to be a highway.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, most Oregonians, I'd like to comment, think it's still a highway. I can go anywhere on it.
I can drive
Yeah.
wherever I want.
Yeah. And I think we share the goal of access. And the conflicts come in when the uses are not compatible or very friendly. Somebody squirreling around in their car doesn't make it a fun place to picnic with your kids. But on the other hand, there is a traditional use. For the record, my father went down on the beach and got driftwood to burn at our cabin. We did it all summer. I don't think we ever had a permit for such a thing. There, and for the record, there was a lot more beach timber. There was a lot more wood on the beach during those days. So I'll be very interested to hear the comments on this because everybody loves it and everybody's concerned. And I would hate to see us just say, oh, no, we're not going to let people drive on the beach anymore, because Oregonians think they can until they get their RV down or their minivan down there and it's stuck. And I hope we have permits for tow trucks.
Thank goodness, that little guy in Pacific City made a ton of money.
My grandson actually finds it very entertaining to sit down there and
And
watch him
watch.
get stuck. So I'll be very interested, and this is something we really need to do. Bring as much clarity to the public about where they can drive and why they can't, where they can't. That needs to be really clear to the public.
DMV rules apply also. There's reckless driving tickets that can be had on the beach if people are doing the donuts or whatever.
If you can catch them.
Yeah, exactly. But they do get caught every once in a while.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how much law enforcement we have.
But it is true that most of the local folks who have sand accessible vehicles know how to use them and use them respectfully. And those people are in my radar too. They've always driven down the beach. They have the vehicle to do it. They get down, they get back. They don't require, and they may drive way over the speed limit, but they aren't zipping by you, and they know that, you know, they have to be good citizens too. So those people I want to protect also.
How often are we seeing a vehicle get stuck and abandoned, and who's picking that cost up when those kind of things happen? Or does it happen?
Yeah, we get a couple. I wish we had a picture of the RV that the guy drove his truck and trailer down on Clatsop Spit and the waves ate it up, and his insurance covers that. You know, we have a lot of things where we have to recover because somebody's uninsured, but generally when they're driving on the beach, those folks are covered. On Clatsop Spit, that's almost a self-policing area too. It's the clamming beaches, and there's thousands of cars that drive up and down during a low tide, and it doesn't have the issues because all of the locals want to keep that tradition alive, and they're not going to tolerate a bunch of folks being crazy.
Yeah, those, yeah.
From the standpoint of our rangers, our beach rangers, do they feel like they have they have all the tools they need that, I mean, are there concerns that they have that aren't necessarily reflected in what we have in place right now?
We could use more presence on the beach. A lot of times these beach rangers, I just did a ride along with 3 of them on the South Coast, and they work alone, and they're, you know, you could get stuck yourself on the beach with an ATV, because we did. And yeah, so it's always helpful to have 2 people with
I
a
want the
shovel.
picture.
And so I think that in the long run, from a safety standpoint, we should be looking at that as well, of having a team together as society changes a little bit
Mhm.
more and more each day, that we would have
Yeah.
those protections available. Because we only have 10 beach rangers for 365 miles of coastline, and not all of it's accessible or drivable. So on the South Coast, there's a lot of adjacent federal land that has the dune buggy access. And so there's a lot of encroachment issues down to sometimes plover areas. And that's where we spend a lot of time really patrolling and having volunteers keep an eye on it. But I think for the most part, we get them excellent equipment, and they just need more staff at some point down there to take care of it. Because it's easy to pull everybody up to the campground where the big potential problems are, but we still have to have a presence on the beach. So it's a matter of service levels and where we're going to put that effort.
Thanks.
I was
Thank you.
gonna ask particularly about that South Coast piece where it does merge into a lot of the dunes onto the beach. And, you know, we're looking at ATV funding tomorrow with safety and law enforcement. I mean, is there a crossover of sheriff or law enforcement that could help support state parks down there?
Yes, especially down in those areas
Yeah.
that are adjacent to each other,
Right.
because folks that are tearing it up on the national dunes
Right,
can't apply that same gas pedal down on the beach.
But they do.
But they do. And so, and that's the tricky part for a beach ranger, because we're not equipped for any of that kind of
Yeah.
enforcement. We're presence in words. We don't give tickets. We can't pursue somebody with a vehicle. So if they're in a plover area, we can get them for being in a plover area, but it's hard. But we have really good partnerships with the sheriff's office and those folks down in the federal LEOs in those dune areas.
so they do cross over and help with some of the beach
Yes.
monitoring.
It's
as
all about
well.
relationships,
That's
and
good.
if we're working with them, they'll work with us.
That's my beach.
Oh, there she is.
That's my beach. That's where I walk.
All right.
Super helpful. No, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Laurel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Laurel. Good job, Katie. See, that wasn't that painful. You
Yeah.
did it. It's a good practice run.
Turn it over to Tabitha, I believe.
Tabitha and Matt.
Bring my copy.
Mhm.
Oh. Where's that? There it is. They have a copy for me. I printed it off. Then I,
You guys have done such a great job with the acquisition conversation. We thought we'd probably talk about disposition. This will be easy.
Well,
Easier.
not-
It'll be more familiar.
That's not tired of us yet.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon. My name is Tabitha Henriksen with the Real Estate Services Group for Opierity. And today we're talking a little bit about property disposition. So many of you may remember the conversation we had in February when we were talking about acquisition criteria in workshop and we're having a conversation and Matt mentioned something that he and I had discussed in tour, just kind of in passing, that I had been looking over some historic disposition data as we were preparing for that acquisition meeting, and we were putting together materials to talk to you all about sort of that acquisition history element of what did it look like at various stages, various eras of leadership for state parks. And I told him, you know, it's interesting, as I was looking at that information, I actually noticed some specific patterns that stood out to me. And I mentioned that to Matt as we were in the car for tour, and he quickly mentioned it in the conversation at the workshop. And I think some of you may remember I said, "Oh, I'm not ready to talk about that yet. I haven't had a chance to look at it very much." So I have spent some time looking at a lot of historic information. My warning is always that, especially when I start talking about historic data, it's only the conclusions you're drawing from it are really only as good as the data you have to work with. And some of you may know that we have some challenges sometimes with our information, this idea that we were sort of birthed from another agency. Sometimes we got all the records we should have gotten, and sometimes we didn't. So I've done my best to proof what I'm going to kind of run over for you real quickly, and I'm not going to go real deep and show you all my spreadsheets. I've just got a couple quick graphs to show you so we can kind of touch on a couple of things that I noticed. So we're going to take a look at two things today, a little bit of historic data, and then take a quick peek at that disposition criteria draft, which should look pretty familiar. It's basically the opposite of the acquisition criteria that we've been talking about. So the thing that stood out to me as I was looking at when we were looking at kind of the under different leaderships, how
Assumption there.
Well, I didn't go as far as our kind of our current time period. I stuck to, you know, pre-2.
I think I've given away the most of them.
Not yet, not yet. So, but one thing, so you'll see, I mean, we've talked about this before, obviously, Boardman is acquiring everything that he can possibly get his hands on, right? He's building the park system. But one thing I think that's kind of surprising to folks sometimes is to see that he also did some dispositions, not very many, but he did do some. And specifically, those were in 1934 to 1938, when, you know, we're post the Great Depression, but there's things he still wants, there's things he still needs for the park system. And so if he can leverage some of that timberland that he's already acquired that might not be good for public recreation in a way that he can get that waterfall or get that thing that he thinks is going to be a better fit, then that is what the agency does. So what really stood out to me is I started to notice that there were similar percentages, even if there were kind of waves during the leadership. And I do want to point out that these are not the same time periods, right? What we're looking at here is the time period that particular director was sort of in leadership, and that leadership criteria was going on. But I started to notice that everything kind of fell in a pretty predictable pattern of however many acres we were bringing in as acquisitions over that leadership, there was somewhere between 20% and 10% of that same number we were also doing in dispositions. And oftentimes those dispositions were us leveraging for exchanges. The frequent parties you see on those are other government parties. If we're exchanging something with a federal agency, exchanging something with a county or another state agency. But also we did quite a bit of exchanges with large timber companies and landowners who they had something that we needed, and we were willing to give up other lands that we had that weren't as ideal for public recreation.
And just to clarify, so you're saying dispositions, that means it's leaving the state system, so not the transfer piece.
Right.
'Cause that might be a whole other
Right.
category of things for another time. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and so some of these are balanced out, you know, you're seeing both the disposition number and the acquisition number maybe in the same year. When you're talking an exchange, sometimes it's acres in and acres out that are even, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes what we wanted was worth more acreage wise than what we were getting rid of, or vice versa. So But these were kind of the trends that stood out to me is for the majority of the agency's history, it's kind of fallen in this range, that seemed to be a natural range, even if the course, and I'll show you, right, kind of another way to look at this, right, is if we look at it by decade. If you look at this sort of mountainous shapes, those are kind of each decade's acquisition number and how they're bringing in lands to the state system. Kind of
That's,
overlaid on that is how much land they're also disposing of. So yes, we're making these acquisitions, but there's a little bit of disposition that we're also doing in each time period. And so you may notice in the 1980s here, we are making acquisitions, but we're disposing of actually more than we're acquiring in that overall decade. But for Talbot's leadership, it kind of balances out. It's interesting how things kind of find their natural rhythm and that
29
same.
years of.
Right, exactly. So things come and go in waves. And we know that some of the decision-making was impacted by what we had for resources at the time, right? If you didn't have resources to go out and acquire property, but you still needed to, you found a way to work with what you had. And maybe because you didn't have as many resources and staff to focus on acquisition efforts, you got a little more creative on the disposition side as well.
is this in the scales acres?
Yes, that scale is acres, and here's another way to look at that same information if that's helpful.
So help me understand, and
Yeah.
there's no criticism in this, I'm just not understand what you're doing. Why do we care about who was the leader?
No, that's just how I initially recognized that there were these patterns as we were kind of putting together the historical information. I just thought it was interesting
Very
that over time, things kind of had a natural balance of we can't just ignore dispositions. We can't just kind of ignore our problem children properties and hope that they go away. Maybe they're not a priority for today. You know, maybe in the 1960s, we're buying, but by the time the 1980s hit and the budget looks a little bit different, suddenly those dispositions are looking really good. That's a way that we can, yeah, that's the way that we can. Yes,
Or maybe
exactly.
need something we didn't.
So when I look at that, I gotta assume that during that whole time period, our total number of acres has always continued up
Yes.
because of it.
Mhm. Yeah, we're always at, with the exception of the 1980s, and it's a pretty narrow margin, it's almost equal. We're always collective, our acreage is always going up a little bit.
And I think part of the reason we wanted to talk about this too is that disposition's kind of always been around. We didn't want it to be a bad word, really. You know, it's just part of doing business, whether it's to leverage property or to get it to another agency that maybe can manage it better, like we've seen. So that was, I think, part of the reason to look at this as well.
Right, and I think you'll notice one of the narrower margins is as we're in that more recently, we didn't do a ton of dispositions in 2010. Most of our efforts were focused on a couple of key acquisition initiatives. But that doesn't mean that it's not a way to solve some problems, and it doesn't mean it's not a way to make sure that we're achieving that OPRD vision that we keep touching base on, right? If we are taking the long view, then we're thinking about land management for the long perspective. And sometimes the best way to protect a special place may be to make sure that the staff resources can be spent on the things that keep it really special rather than some element of the park that maybe has turned into a management hazard or a safety hazard, something along those lines. So that, I think, is my thought. I wanted to kind of get your perspective on how are you feeling about dispositions currently and whether you feel like these disposition criteria, which we have sort of made to just be kind of the mirror image of the acquisition criteria, meets what you expect for what you want to see staff bringing to you for dispositions. Because we want to be doing these pieces that are captured here as far as taking action and working cooperatively with others. We think there's a lot of room for maybe some exchanges with other agencies and those kinds of things, but that will mean certain lands leaving the park system in exchange maybe for properties that we feel are a better fit for our portfolio. And so I want to make sure that what we're using for criteria and guidance that's coming from you matches your expectations, so that when we're here and we're talking about a specific transaction, we're all on the same page.
I have a question, and maybe a difficult answer, but for those of you who have been tracking this or thinking about it or reading through documents, are there lessons learned? Like, are there examples of when we got rid of something where we went, oh, we should have done that? Or I'm just sort of curious about and maybe it's the intuitive reasoning that goes in saying, yeah, no, that doesn't, I mean, is there any sort of.
I mean, there's probably other people in the room that have a longer perspective than mine, because mine's only 16 years old, but I would say no, there is nothing that we've looked back and went, that was the wrong decision. I do know that when the shift went from Tim to me, even in the interim,
In terms of dispositions, I know you're thinking acquisition, but go ahead. So go ahead.
well, yeah, acquisitions. Oh, yeah. I could give you a list of acquisitions, but I'm super excited because now we have things to dispose of. There are several things that I wish we would have never bought.
Yeah,
and-
that I get.
But the disposition conversation that first year, even when I was like, I will not be the director, I don't want to do this. Was the counties and the cities and those folks all coming in and saying, you're not being good partners, right? Like, we literally had Oregon Solutions come in and tell us that we needed to figure out how to work better together, because a lot of people don't understand, like, Detroit Lake is not owned by the state. Like, I just had a long conversation with a legislator about Joseph Stewart, right? It's a BOR property. Like, the public doesn't always know. And so to me, the biggest lesson over the last 16 years, or even 10 sitting in the director's seat, is it's our responsibility collectively to be managing these places for public access. And if there is an opportunity for the state to manage a federal or county property or a city property or metro or a special district better than the other, we were literally directed by the legislative branch to work with the counties, cities, and special districts to figure out how we could have these cooperative conversations. And we've done 3 of them now, in the middle of one more IGA with Grand Run over for Yamhill. And it has been the best partnership, because we can literally have the dialogue of, don't think about it in my mind as yes, it's leaving the state park system, but it's actually going to another place that can leverage the now 25% of our budget that goes to local government grants. And it gives it the opportunity to be invested in better than they would probably never prioritized for us to the same level. So I actually hope to see more of it going in that direction, to have a very collective conversation about there isn't a whole lot more land that needs to come into public ownership or recreation access. If anything, I'd love to start putting us in the dialogue with the feds to figure out how we could help manage some of those things. I know nobody else wants to hear that quite yet, but I mean, that's probably the next phase, is can we have the special districts, the counties, the cities managing some of these other places, while we maybe start thinking more collectively about some bigger opportunities for the state of Oregon.
And Chair Allen, if I may answer your question as
yeah.
your property manager. There is times, not so much that the disposition is the problem, but that not finishing details around the disposition is the problem. So we still have quite the backlog of LWCF related issues where ODOT maybe disposed of something, did an exchange, got it 99% of the way done, and then just didn't cross that finish line. So those are property management things that I think we have to be really conscientious of and really careful of when we get into these conversations. We're also dealing with several properties that, part of our rules is that if we're going to do a complete transfer of a property to another entity, we're leaving in reversionary language that if they're not going to manage it for public recreation, it comes home. And in some cases, some of those things we don't want to come home particularly.
No, they're all special.
That's
Tabitha.
right. And that's
We
how we
hope
need
they
to
can come
execute
back.
on it. But sometimes we're less than delighted when they want to come home.
That's how ODOT feels about us a lot of the time.
I think there's a space too, though, that we should think about disposing, not necessarily for continued public use, but looking particularly in the tribal context of thinking about historical uses for tribes that have not had access to acquiring these properties in previous decades. And is there a place to dispose of some pieces that we have into their own space that would not be necessarily public access or public managed for the public good? So I just think we should think through that a little bit too, because I don't think we have. in the
No, and
past.
thankfully, for your approval to move forward with the legislative concept for House Bill 2737. That would then give us permission to do those things, because legally right now, I mean, even in this dialogue with Grand Ron, we can't. So just try to get that.
Initially is to get to, hopefully to get to that next step, but I think you're right, and we built, and you'll see tomorrow as we get into the acquisition policy draft, that some of that language is in there anticipating that this will go through to start having those kind of conversations.
The bigger piece for you guys to think about in this is so that mentality is out there now, right? And so it may be that the communities come and say they want to do this. And if they come and say, well, we want to take over Silver Falls, or we would love to take Fort Stevens, like, what is your criteria? What is your standards? And what is your policy direction to us, so that we were really clear? So the conversation doesn't need to go any further, or that we know that we're in the same space with you, that.
Yeah, it's a fine line.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually part of the reason we wanted to start this dialogue now and have a little bit of overlap between the acquisition and disposition, is again, in anticipation that House bill is going to go through and those questions will start for sure.
Commissioner Dorr, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I raised my hand a while ago, and so in part I was following up on Commissioner Hill's suggestion. Of course, we've had some good discussions about disposition prioritization and having all of these options like local governments, feds, and of course tribal interests in mind as we think about these alternatives for lands that may be disposed of. And I know that in the past, when we've had disposition conversations, it seems the tribes are always in that conversation, or at least we're discussing the tribes. Whether or not they're actually talking back with us about these things is not always clear. But at least I think we're in agreement that that's an appropriate strategy within the traditional lands of individual tribes, within the ceded lands of individual tribes. And so I support that. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't. I know that we're saying we don't have any regrets about past disposition. I've had the odd personal experience of having to sit through entire days of testimony. Ironically, this worked to our favor when people are confused about who is involved with the ownership of particular lands, as we were talking about before with BOR and so forth, because when Stubb Stewart was created and the Arcadia property east of Highway 101 was
That's a regret.
transmitted to that particular landowner and fell into a kind of zoning where it would be appropriate to develop an RV park on the property that everybody assumed was state park lands. There was a lot of fury, but actually we were shielded from it somewhat because people didn't learn about it much until kind of after the fact, to be blunt. I know that the procedures have changed now in terms of public disclosure, but
He froze. Yeah, that is one.
can you still hear me?
Yeah.
You froze.
Okay, so, but people did not begin to respond to that much until the specific proposal for the development of the RV park came forward. And at that point, all of their complaints about that particular transaction were directed, ironically, at the county government and presented in county testimony, which the county staff kept reminding people this is not our decision, and those decisions have already been made. But having witnessed that and the effects in terms of local politics and the mobilization of nonprofits and so on the North Coast, I guess I would mention that, say we do occasionally have regrets, but again, things have changed a lot since then. That was a long time ago that particular property fell out of our control. And knowing what we know now, I don't know that we would do exactly the same thing in terms of some of those transactions with that individual. So anyway, I mentioned that. I'd be remiss to not mention it because I was right there witnessing the spectacular outcomes at the local the county government. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Dorr.
So much like the watch list that we've discussed with acquisitions, the staff maintain a non-essential lands list. So these are lands that throughout the system, we've identified that we feel like basically meet disposition criteria and are not necessarily something that OPRD wants to continue to have in their portfolio. We're going to, similar to how we did with the watch list, kind of reassess what has already been flagged for that list and take a fresh look at it. As Alice was mentioning, sometimes there are specific grant responsibilities or deed restrictions that impact where a property can go, what can be done with it, and what would actually be the solution if we did want to dispose of it. So all of those things would be considered in sort of the formation of that list. Mr. Shipsey, is there anything you wanted to add about I know that Kami has mentioned before that you've specified that endowment property, non-essential lands, that they have to be a piece of property that there's not already basically a planning effort behind. Does that ring a bell?
No.
Okay.
No, I think what Cami and I were talking about is that deed restriction on how we receive the property and what were to happen to it if we were no longer to be the property
Okay.
holder.
Okay.
Whatever is restricted, like we would.
But I reserve the right to remember.
Sounds great.
As long as it's not that, and that won't pertain to two places that I would love to dispose of.
All right, so here are sort of our draft language for the criteria. So these should look relatively familiar, but feel free that if you don't like how something's phrased, if you have questions, let's engage and talk about it. Property that are good candidates for disposition do not possess outstanding natural, scenic, cultural, historic, and recreation qualities of statewide significance. They do not have recreational, natural, historic, or cultural attributes that are rare or not otherwise represented in the state park system. And they may include obligations or limitations that require a preservation of lands and waters by excluding people rather than enabling resource-rich benefit to the human experience. Is there any?
So, I mean, I just commented to Liz, the comments about tribal, exchanges. When I look at this, I'm like, well, maybe it does possess some of these things, but nevertheless. So I mean, I guess that would be one sort of thing I'm thinking about. So not it's a both and maybe, or rather than an either or, is thinking about how to create a space for something like that.
Okay.
When I think about the last two we've done, they both have those things, right? Like Oregon Health has a lot of historical and
Right.
cultural. I think that's where it's gonna have to be you deciding what's of state park significance versus that, almost the definition of statewide, I don't know. 'Cause
Well, so
Right.
you have this,
Nothing's really.
you have this under mission impact, which I think makes a lot of sense, but it's just maybe, is there an and? Which is.
Yeah, that
there
is.
is an impact, and
Yeah.
then there are other considerations, which,
Right.
whatever that category is called, which is. Mission impact aside, there may be other good reasons for
Someone else can
Manage
do
or-
do the mission better than we can.
Yeah.
Right.
I think is the thing I'm looking, that obverse of this. They may have that significance, but somebody else could fulfill that mission
Equal
either
or better.
equal or better.
That's
if-
Cascadia.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Cascadia
exactly
is-
of Cascade.
Yeah. Like if you can't do it and put that in the reversionary clause, if
Considering
it
it
can't be
has
done equally or
so
better.
much historic.
It's still,
significance to
it's
me.
doing great. It's doing great.
Well, and similar to the acquisition criteria, something doesn't have to check off every criteria, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's such a tough call sometimes, is, does it check off enough? Is it meet enough criteria that we feel like, yes, without a doubt, this is the direction we want to go?
Commissioner Dewar's
I
hands back
think
up.
this language is pretty. Do not with that
I
underline.
know, the not.
There isn't a step in Oregon that doesn't have somebody who loves it dearly. So I think I would like this language to be a little
Mhm.
more.
So maybe maybe
Not-
something more like may not.
Yeah, or, yeah, not so.
And
it's
maybe
a
one more
little-
bullet around management or.
And then that piece about, or somebody else could
Because again,
They
if
may
there
be
are
a more
properties we
appropriate
have,
Steward for cultural, historical, resource management or other reasons, right?
right? Or something
I'm
about another land manager being able to provide outstanding recreational, natural, historic.
And it does look
whatever.
like Commissioner Dewar's hand is up.
Yeah,
Commissioner Berger says it really well. This can't be this aggressive because the perspectives of all of us are so different. I don't know how to write this where it makes sense. With, you know, I won't hesitate to admit, I think we need more parks in Eastern Oregon. And if you love the coast and those big, tall, green things that grow over here, and you get out there and there aren't any of those big, tall, green things, you may not like it. And yet the values are the same to a different set of people. So balancing this, I don't think it's going to be easy. And it's not as simple as those statements in my mind.
Agreed.
Commissioner Dewar, sorry.
That's all right. No, these are all very good points, very good conversation, and I appreciate that. Getting into some nuances that are important to think about, and I'm probably leaping ahead in a couple of things I'm saying. One is it is important to state that there are entities that are better at taking care of certain types of resources and certain kinds of responsibilities than OPRD, and that we should find those opportunities sometimes and act on them. And that may well be ahead of us here as some of the language we'll see shortly. But I also, I guess when we're discussing these things, I'm reflecting on the question of scale, like the scale of the analysis. Are we talking about the entire unit, for example, not meeting these standards, or would we be looking at smaller portions of larger parks and saying, well, this corner of that park doesn't really meet these standards and doesn't provide any resource protection for the other things that we do value in other parts of a very large park? Those areas could go. I'm wondering if maybe I'm leaping ahead again. I apologize if I am, but I'm wondering if maybe we could hear some comment on that question. Are we talking about parks as a whole, or are we actually talking about putting large parks under the microscope and saying, are there parts of these parks that do satisfy these criteria and parts that don't?
No, that's a great point, because it also could be just be an easement. It could
Right.
be, it could be cleanup of lot line adjustments. It could be a neighbor needs
Right.
things adjusted because they're their pet. I mean, this is everything. So I guess not think about just the wholesale disposition of a state park. This would be,
Yeah.
those ones are easier.
And many of the things identified in our non-essential lands list are just that. They're a portion of a parcel. There may be something that's on the other side of the road that's isolated from visitors and staff, that's harder to service. Something that has a particular management concern. It doesn't necessarily have to be the entirety of a park or our property holding there.
So you could use the word parcel.
Yep, totally.
Yeah, and would there be guidance though in terms, because I think that the question of scale is significant. I guess I think about it geographically and think, well, are we talking, I know we probably know the scale when we see it. We know what seems intuitively correct in terms of this is a parcel that we might consider getting rid of. But if we were to look at some of our parks and say, well, we could take out a piece here and a piece there and a couple of acres in this location and that, there's some advantage in being able to sort of chip away on the edges if we need to, but also I think that there's maybe some downsides, of course, to looking at larger parks and saying, well, this part's essential, this part isn't, let's start breaking it up. So I wonder if we're going to provide guidelines in terms of how we handle those kinds of cases. Again, they're the obvious easy ones, like, the individual parcel that was a wayside in the late 20s and nobody loves it and it should go. But there are these cases where we do have larger parks where some parts are clearly essential and some less so. And I wonder if we might want to actually provide some guidance on those points of like, do we really get down to looking at individual acres, or do we just talk about larger proportions? I think that there's some value in thinking about the scale of that, because I think that it could have a lot of implications if we really start talking about a more aggressive disposition strategy where we're taking out pieces of larger parks, and what are the standards that are required and how do we substantiate that to the public who loves this part of the park but doesn't really care about that part of the park, for example. So Anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. These are procedural details, but they strike me as important ones in some ways too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Were there any other thoughts about mission impact before we move on?
I don't like and, can you just put or in there instead for me, historic or recreational qualities?
Yes.
So that it's not all inclusive of this.
Yes, definitely.
Soften this.
And we actually have 2 slides here for strategic objectives. So disposition is consistent with our long-range planning, enhances existing areas, or strategically leverages replacement lands or funding. Property may be inconsistent with priorities and plans adopted by the commission, and or the disposition is consistent with the department's planning efforts. There are no known maintenance or enhancement plans that are dependent on retaining that property. Property is an attractive nuisance and may experience one or more of the following: low visitation, concerns about how the public is using the site, serious visitor or employee safety issues, or inadequate law enforcement. Property does not buffer existing properties or resolve management or legal issues or provide replacement lands anticipating the whole-scale loss of parks. Property is not important for consolidation of state park parcels, trail systems, or greenways, or needed for access purposes. Property provides no benefit to the department toward the goal of extending or improving public service in the face of changes wrought by human development, climate change, and epic environmental events like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, floods, and wildfires.
I have a question about the people have mentioned before the underlining of the no thing. I mean, I'm wondering if in some cases it's no or limited. Do you know what I'm saying? Because,
Right.
you know, to have to make the argument of none is,
Good luck.
someone could say,
Someone-
well, you know, but so I mean, if the point is that the costs and benefits of keeping it, that the benefits are limited, there might be some, but when you weigh everything, they're not sufficient. So I just wonder if that gives us a little more
So maybe
discretion to
something like
say,
insufficient.
it's not that
rather
there's
than-
no benefit to access or something like that,
Right.
but honestly, when you look at the cost of it, so something like that might.
Could you go to the next one? Go to the next one. please.
Yes.
The second one. The last one, do we have the goals of improving public service in the face of changes wrought by human developed climate change and epic environmental events like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, eruptions, floods, and wildfires? Where did that come from?
We worked through that at the last workshop in April for the.
And that was the same language?
Acquisition criteria. yes.
Okay. I wanted to make sure we have that language
Yes.
somewhere else because that's pretty,
Assuming you adopt the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in your,
Go ahead of this.
yeah.
and Vicky, it's in the folder, the blue folder that we got from Denise. It's on the table there.
Yeah, it's in here. I know. I've read it, but I
I
don't
don't know
know.
that we came up with this specific language, but we did talk about climate change, maybe.
Yeah,
we-
it's
I-
in
I
here,
don't
but
remember
it's in there in
specific.
that language.
Yeah.
B3.
Okay, so that's, I guess that's what I'm
Yes,
Well, and
I'm asking. Does it reflect the same,
yes.
the obverse of
These
the?
are nearly verbatim with the exception of their dogs.
The opposite of.
Well, and I think I remember Commissioner Berger, you had started this section with this, and you said this is a pretty dark start.
Yeah, yeah. I was been bothered by this language all along. I guess what concerns me about it is, as an agency and our ability, it sounds like we're taking on earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, floods and wildfires, and I don't feel capable of handling those things.
Thank you.
And,
Fair.
and all those, and climate impacts. I mean, yeah, they are part, we deal with them, but in the face of those changes, I'm pretty frightened.
So would a change be that it helps improve park service rather than public service if it narrows it? Because, you've got different erosion that we're
right.
facing. And so we know we want to get some parcels. If there's a river that's slowly eroding and people are losing,
Highway 101.
right?
Redo this on that, but I've always been afraid of saying we're gonna do something that it's not impossible for us to do.
Yeah, I guess the way I see this is that we're not throwing up our hands and saying, hey, if stuff happens and it all disappears, like, we did
We
our
don't have to
best.
take
Not
it.
that you're saying that at all, but it's more of, we see that things are changing. We want to try to be prepared. We can't
Proactive.
control the change. We can't do that. We
Yeah.
just want to see if there's something that happens with where we acquire or dispose of property, it might put us in a better place to provide the same or similar level of service in the future based on what we think we know. So.
Because it's planned to just, I mean, I feel like that conversation happens so much more
It's
with
in here.
acquisition.
Right.
Versus
Yeah.
disposition. And so is there an opportunity? I mean, do we want to change the language
Well,
for
but-
disposition or is it?
But
you know,
for example, though, if we wanted to vacate a property per se on the Oregon coast because we wanted to retreat to go to a higher ground, maybe it would be, I mean, it's so situational, it's hard to make this.
But I think another example is kind of the way I see the future of reservoirs.
Yeah.
That may be another area where we've had property along a reservoir for years, but that may be something that we don't want to kind of continue engaging in because the reservoir is no longer retaining water. So that's kind of how I read that language, similar to Commissioner Blash, what you were saying. I think it helps frame the retreat strategy along the coast or, some of those different issues.
I see it.
Maybe
I see where it is under the
access.
strategic
Public-
objective in here.
It's not.
It goes along with the.
I
score.
don't- it's not public service.
Park service.
Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with.
Right.
that public
Because
service.
all you're really doing here is making sure that you have some type of long-term vision around how are we gonna continue to have parks available for the future, knowing.
Considering.
Because we can't sit here and go, there is no climate change. I mean, I know humans are saying that, but we can't, like, it's, we have to have some retreat strategies and investing in millions and millions of dollars in some of these places that Mother Nature is gonna win.
Well,
So-
and I think too about some of these like this one in particular, we might not have been thinking that way 10, 15 years.
We
ago when
weren't.
A property ended up on the non-essentials lands list. And so now taking this lens and
Second.
looking back
Mhm.
over, this might be a reason to pull certain properties off the list and say we need to keep them.
And
Yeah.
I 100% understand and agree that this language is important. It should be there and
It's not
understand why
right.
it's there. I just don't think the verbiage is correct.
The verbiage isn't.
That's what I'm struggling with is this like goals of extending or improving public service in the face. And that's a reason we would dispose of a piece of land. I feel like it maybe should be public access or,
Yeah.
I mean, it's, literally when the ocean shore is washing away. I don't know who would take it, who would dispose of it to, but I mean, I don't know if that's. I don't know.
It's
No,
the
that
goals
makes
of
sense.
providing
Yeah.
parks for future generations. It's really what it is.
Right,
It's not
right.
extending or improving,
Right,
it's providing
Providing.
parks.
I think also part of the challenge you're getting into is this conversation of where as a public agency, we're here to provide public service. And yes, our focus is on parks and recreation and we're a state government. So like if people need a different type of service, like, I don't know, I think that's where I
Not
can
our
see this
mission,
being a little
yeah.
bit more broad, but
Yeah.
it's not our
Yeah.
mission, but it's also, I think that's just the thing I think we struggled with before. So I imagine that's maybe why we put public service because there's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah.
And it's all couched in the, acquisition as the OPRD.
Can I ask a very small question? It's a previous slide.
Yeah.
Which is why you chose to use the word known plans? When there are no known plans?
No, that's our enhancement plan.
I'm just so curious about, I mean, I could see like, as far as we know, there are no plans. I mean, I know that that's what it's getting at, but it's like, oh, and then we found out, we got rid of it, but then we found out there was a plan. I'm just interested in why that was included. And I could see why. It's almost like it's a little bit of a.
We didn't know.
We're gonna get rid of
Ignorance is bliss. I had no idea. Yeah.
What do you mean? We agreed to what?
As far as we know, there is no, I mean, it's sort of like saying like there may be an easement in some
Or a deed
county
restriction.
office, no offense,
Yeah.
Seacrest, that says something and we didn't know about it. And so we went ahead and did it. But as far as we knew, there wasn't anything. And in fact, there was, but as far as we knew, there wasn't, right?
We didn't know, we didn't know, and we still don't know anything.
We've documented right there.
That's fine. It gives us an out. I sorry, didn't know.
I'm not comfortable with the legal defense of nobody told me.
Yeah, I'm
No, I was just curious.
I like a little softening there.
Urgent opportunity. Prompt disposition or exchange of property allows for the department to seize on an opportunity that would otherwise be lost. There is a probability of successful disposition or exchange with minimal risk. The property is attractive for exchange purposes. Disposal can be leveraged to gain something more desirable for the department and the public. The likely outcome if the department is unable to complete a proposed exchange. So would we have loss of significant potential resource like a natural, historic, etc., or some sort of property access?
I think the first two says the third.
So just eliminate 3. You don't think it's necessary?
Well, I don't,
I think we can rework it.
Rework
Yeah,
and put it
yeah.
into 1 and 2.
yeah,
Yeah, that seems like it's putting the, I mean, it's about the, it's a different animal. It's like, if you can't come up with a good feel, but I mean, that's not a criteria. That's just how I mean, the way things work out, right? Engagement. Responds to changes in public demand, including community impacts. Disposition or exchange of the property would be feasible in terms of community support, property obligation, or limitations in staffing. The department does not have a development plan and or management of the property requires undue resources to provide tangible public benefits. The property is not cost effective to maintain or represents an unacceptable risk to the agency. Evaluation of known or anticipated community impacts, both positive and negative. Long-term benefit is not present in that evaluation. Disposal of the property would not eliminate an access or experience for an underrepresented population.
again, I don't like getting line knots. We need to change
Yeah,
that language.
I think we'll solve
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not sure that. I'm saying the same thing twice in there.
I also think that like, if this engagement pot is like response to changes in public demand, including community impacts, maybe there's a community that wants to manage a part or wants to manage a piece. I feel like this language doesn't reflect necessarily a strong presence of a tribe, a community, another agency, somebody else wanting to take on those responsibilities. And so that is really, in my opinion, what engagement should be, is like, if there are other entities that want to do this and can't do a good job, that should be reflected in here as a priority. In my opinion.
Yeah, I think one of the things kind of overall I've been thinking out is there's a way that property enters the system and then the way it exits isn't necessarily the same way it came in. Right? Like sometimes you come in a room and you go out a different door, there's different ingress and egress. And so I think the exercise of simplicity to say, cool, let's just look at the opposite of the acquisition strategy makes a lot of sense. I just wonder where there are things like this example where things are not necessarily with acquisition, we want something. And I think with disposition, it might be somebody else wants what we have more, right? I think there's like a different thing that it's not pushing it out because we don't want it. It's because where is there a better place for it? And I know it's a weird thing to think of land like that is just this stuff you move around, but that's a whole problem with the capitalist society, the global economy. Sorry. The Marxist in me. So, but yeah, there's maybe some other things as you go through of after this feedback of like, what are things that would draw people to want some of the things that we might have acquired. There's just maybe another way to look at some of the other exits that aren't coming in through the front door. So I think I've used enough random metaphors. So I'll stop.
As I look at this, I'm wondering about some of the terms and definitions of the last 3 words, underrepresented population. you know, is that as narrow as a small group of attorneys who are surfers, or are we talking?
He's out of the room.
Yeah, or, you know, are we talking tribes?
Yeah.
A community, you know,
For the
what,
homeless,
or the, yeah.
unhoused, sorry.
So I guess let's be careful what we put in there that we can't define.
I think it's a good point, and again, I think if just looking at each of these criteria, if we go back and soften some of the
Yeah.
language, I think that'll give us the, you know, the kind of ability to navigate depending on what the situation is. I think that's probably gonna help us a lot, because that'll lead a lot of that to dialogue and
I think there's already just all of them, and maybe they're more, but super helpful just in terms of that. Are we asking the right are we asking these questions? Are we considering all these facets? And as you say, if you're softening it a little bit to give people that discretionary ability to say, there is a development plan and there's an entity that would be much better at managing this place. So it's not as if you're locked in saying, there's a development plan, sorry, can't get rid of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point, because I don't think any one of these criteria should shut the door on the others. Kind of, you know.
Yeah. Did you know you're part of an underrepresented group?
You're only lightly attacked.
Properties deemed to be non-essential lands to the park system will be evaluated for potential transfers to partners. While a parcel may not reach a level of statewide significance, it may be an outstanding historical,
There you go.
local, or regional resource suitable for management.
To done.
Right? With commission approval, the department may convey to other public agencies and tribes, which I mean, maybe we should asterisk, because it's coming soon, you know. like, at less than fair market value, if there is a reversionary clause in the conveyance instrument that ensures that the property will be used for public park and recreation purposes.
Can we do that now?
With the exception of tribes.
The tribes, we don't have legal.
So we're adding the tribes, and that's what's in the legislation. that
yeah.
we've been- Oh, I'm sure it'll pass because everything's just zipping through the legislature.
Hey, it made it to the house and it was 60-0, right? I mean, 60-0, it was very,
There's
it was
stuff in the-
popular.
Did it get through the Senate?
No, it got to the Senate,
Then it's
never got to
there.
Senate. Like everything else.
I mean, I guess
Coming back,
I'm gonna keep harping on this, but the last.
The public piece.
Yeah, that last piece will be used for public park and recreation purposes. I mean, we have a lot of stuff in our inventory that has tribal significance and, you know, there are reasons why we might want to convey a piece or a portion, a corner of a piece of property that we have that would be very significant for a tribe that they would not want the public recreating on
Right.
or public
Right.
park purposes. So that last piece just raises a red flag, and I'm wondering if we can expand it to be, you know, something highlighting, you know, historical or natural significance.
Or in this case, is it that it reverts if the other entity is not capable of managing it for the reasons it was, right? Because it might be less about why it comes back to us and more about what they're capable of continuing to provide. Which wouldn't need to be specific to public park and recreation purposes or anyway.
Right.
I agree, and I think about some of the other properties that we have outside of kind of cultural or heritage resource values of like some of the state scenic byway or, you know,
Like corridors.
Thank you. That really, that's what they are. They're not meant for recreation or, you know, so I think there's a way that we can change that language to maybe go from there.
And it could just be cultural, scenic, park and recreation purposes or some other, something like that, more closer to aligned to our mission.
Yeah.
Although I will say that it has been super helpful in some conversations with the tribes to keep talking about public access, especially when there's LWCF and other things that make it really difficult to mitigate. And in some cases, and it's hard because situationally, there may be a property that we want to be very specific about. So I think if you added the cultural piece in there, so it's not just used for park and recreation purposes, it could be cultural or
Well, we'll take a look at this too. I think this came from some of our procedural stuff. I'm not
Mhm.
sure. Want to make sure the.
It's just a
reference is
different
correct.
frame that we've
Yeah.
really looked at it. Mhm. Yeah.
And
So-
again, like you just said, Matt, the purpose of this is not to restrict decision-making, but to give guidance and, prompt certain considerations while going forward, as opposed to sort of saying, I don't know, do you want it? No, I don't want it. Or it's gonna.
Right. Well, I mean, for example, is the Minot property, right? Like, we don't want that to be
Exactly. That's
public
what
and.
it's designed for.
Yeah. I mean, that's when we wanted protected and.
I mean, it's almost like it could just be a period. after
Yeah.
Fair market value,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah.
And then we
Yeah.
have considerations of, will it be used for public access, recreational purposes?
Those could be questions you ask.
Yeah,
Yeah.
questions you ask based on the nature
Of
of
the
why it would
transaction.
be,
Yeah.
I
conveyed.
think that's a great point. And so this is also taken from the acquisition draft policy, which there, it makes sense, right? Because it would be something coming into the system where, for the most part, we're going to treat it differently than maybe something that's going out of the system. No, it's a really good point.
Quite the assumption, quite the assumption that this would be a wonderful discussion.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks for all your.
Were there any final?
Just going back to that last slide real quick, I just want to make sure I'm clear where you talked about the reversionary clause. That was put in there specifically if we're selling at less than fair market value.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
because they're trying to make sure that the
Less.
public is getting like
Yeah.
whatever
Well,
dollars that went in, they're getting some,
And we'll
some
need to check
benefit
and
out.
see, is this captured in a rule or statute somewhere that there's
Yeah.
a reason why this language is here? And I think
Yeah.
there may be. So we may be limited, or we may need to take some action that
Mhm.
opens
Change
our
some
options.
legislative.
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that makes sense because yeah, I mean, if you're selling something, you don't necessarily get to say what people get to do with it because they
Right.
don't want it.
No,
You're
the
paying
reason
for
we
it.
could get in there, get our go up is because we have some of those other
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
luxuries.
Great.
Das, because
Mhm.
that's had to do the.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. You don't want just, selling the farm for nothing. So
Mhm.
I'm good now. Thanks.
You made it even more wonderful.
Yeah.
This is great. No, thank you. This is
Yeah.
super thought provoking and, just.
We just
Well,
when
and
you're
thank
already
you.
on
I
a
heard some
roll, we
really
love to
nice
have those.
strategic thinking over here too, as far as we don't want to create criteria that are then leveraged against us if we're interested in disposing of something. And then someone just capitalizes on a particular point and
Give
tries to
yourself flexibility.
Yeah. limit our options.
Nicely done, Tabitha.
Nice job. Thanks for all that
Yeah.
data, that historic data.
It's fun to
That
watch.
really Perspective. How much we,
I can't wait to see what it looks like for the last 10 years.
yeah, I can't wait to see the sum.
I know. Gives it all away.
I was gonna say, the reason I didn't bring it all the way current is I know we still have some outstanding transactions that we haven't added their data to our data set. So I didn't want it to skew and look a little bit bizarre for you, but we've got some great acquisitions in process right now, and it'll be really interesting to see
Yeah,
that. I'd
I'm
be happy to bring
curious,
that at a
yeah.
different time to see, so you guys can take a look.
Because every time I feel like we've given so much away, I'm like, oh, but we just did 3 new. So I'd be curious. to
I
see.
don't think you're as far off.
I think it's the same, really.
I don't think you're very far off.
Got to prune the tree, right?
Right.
Makes for
No,
more healthy
right.
growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in almost every era of parks, they did a lot of the same activities. They
Mhm.
leveraged things for exchanges that were practical for the agency. There were opportunities where, whether it was a wayside that really, or some sort of property that was really more transportation oriented, or it was a group that really wanted that park, they wanted that local control and spoke up and asked for it. It was all the same sort of logic, the same kind of people being people, and they're wanting control over those kind of local values that oftentimes ended up in a whole park transfer to a local entity.
Got a couple more I want to get done. Mhm.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's always that big. Yeah.
That's useful to almost include at some point. Doesn't mean,
Yeah.
not that you might. Some people might think of it immediately, but to prompt people to say, is there something here that's not necessarily full disposition, but a change of, some of that? That's really interesting.
It's super helpful for us though, just to hear your perspective because we're doing it. and We think we're somewhere in the, and we are, which is really good to hear.
It's hard. Yeah, this is really hard.
All right.
Anything else?
No, I think you are.
Thank you.
You're good, Denise.
And thank you.
Dinner
Katie and
logistics.
team
so-
for-
We'll have cars
My usual stuff.
lined up to go.
5